Tony, you and I speak a number of times about how, this is my words, not yours, so that's not what Tony says, but it's around the subject of tech companies, and we're a tech company, will push the need for ever-increasing tooling, AI this, ML that, and that's in the box. But a lot of the time when you get to talk to customers, it's about those topics, but when you get more nearer the relationship, it goes back to the basics. It goes back to doing the basics well to be able to do the next bit that makes the most out of AI, ML, all those bits of tools. Because if you haven't got the foundations to build that upon, all the AI in the world's not going to help you, right? And that's what we find. So main topic for today was around contract obligations, risk mitigation and risk controls, which are sometimes dry subjects at the best of time, right, to give it a bit of personality. But what does that all mean to you? Let's start, I suppose, with contractual obligations, right?
Absolutely. So 100% agree that fundamentally everyone's on this maturity journey. And it's like a ladder, right? You can have all the rungs of the ladder at the top, but if you haven't got those first couple of runs, you're not going to get further up and mature.
Yeah.
So where that sticks in terms of contract management, and this is how it's often referred to, right? Especially in the field. And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think on one end of the spectrum, people view contract management as simply, I've got a contract, or I've got a little bit of data about my contract in terms of maybe a start date, hopefully an end date, something around some indication of value, which may be or maybe not be accurate. And then hopefully it'll be, the document will be there in a file repository somewhere. So when the field and in the market says contract management, they're really talking about just managing at that highest level. And that's fine, and that's a great place to start, and the place you should start when you're doing and when you're managing your suppliers. However, where we see the real value being driven is by what's actually in the contract. What are the set of instructions, commitments, obligations that are going to make this a successful relationship and partnership? And I think, as we all know, contracts, especially complex ones, can be difficult to disseminate and understand. But I kind of take a little bit of a maybe almost trivial approach in terms of ultimately what has to happen, who's responsible, not just beyond just the organization, the buyer or the supplier. It's like which functional teams are actually involved and the people involved in this, and ultimately when do they have to do it? And I think if you take that lens to the problem and start off in a kind of incremental fashion, meaning what's the most important things within the contract that you're looking to get, you can quickly run up those runs of the ladder.
I find it's the research companies and the tech companies and somewhat of the traditional procurement, life cycle procurement wheel, right? Like the S to C, source to contract. You kind of almost, I don't think intentionally does, but it almost infers that once you read a lot of them, that once you've authored a contract and then maybe you pay the supplier well or on time, that's it done. Mm-hmm. Right? That's it. It's all about that post-contract sort of due diligence, or just that level of, as you say, digitising that contract, and then you're out, right? There's nothing else to do. But in reality, that's so far from the truth, especially when you mention complex deals, right? Some of these deals are hundreds of millions or $1 billion in size and are 5 years in length, right? I know I worked on one that had 1,500 obligations, right? That needed to get done from both sides, and it just wasn't tracked anywhere. So, Jesse, maybe you want to pick up on that a bit and talk a bit more around that need and that need for the rigor or the post-contract problem.
For sure. Completely agree. We see this a lot. I mean, we launched into obligations. Sometimes we see just the end date, right? The end date and some helpful reminder so it doesn't just blow past me would be my first step in my journey towards managing contracts. And like Tony said, fine, that is appropriate. I suppose what we see in the market is sometimes an embedded belief that to get into the meaning of the thing, the centerpiece of this whole relationship, is going to take a mountainous amount of work. And maybe historically it kind of has. And, you haul in lawyers to flip pages and distill and understand and boil out your 1,500 obligations. What's called for is a way to much more quickly discover those And then upon discovering them, don't just put them on the digital shelf then, again, once discovered, as has historically been done with the document itself, but fold those into a cadence of management, of visitation, of further distillation to pull out things like the service levels that are committed to, if it's one of those kind of service contracts, and then manage those all in automated fashion, right? That's what we really care about. And this gets down from where I started out in this conversation about why is value for money missed so often. It's missed because that which we hoped for and hammered out to the tune of 1,500 obligations got away from us when one or two people left the org and some new drama happened. Had this stuff been digitized, had the facts been on the platform as the people moved in and out, had the obligation met, yes or no, risk associated just to that one captured, actions specific just to that other one captured, ongoing measurement of, is this thing being delivered? Again, let's take a service level agreement example. Is that automated and on rails? That act alone results in a 26% increase in quality of service, which also includes some hard dollar savings over time. So we think this is about more than, it's far beyond housekeeping. It's getting into value management and value generation, such that which was the beginning envisioned can actually happen. And as all that we haven't talked about this, but as all the changes come in and those obligations are modified, that itself is captured and folded into a clean list of obligations on us, each other today. Evergreen, always framing the agreement, even if it doesn't look like that contract we hammered out 5 years ago. Different people in our companies 5 years ago. That is the promise, right? That's real contract management.
That's interesting because you almost get that notion of a contract becomes something like written in stone when actually it's not really. It's written in plasticine, right? And it will change, right? They're going to morph it and mold it, and you can't. To your point earlier, Tony, have a contract vehicle that's so inflexible that all the value goes out of it, and the innovation, the creativity of the two companies working together, right? And that's where you get your best opportunity is that relationship part. So which isn't born out of the contract. So the contract piece is key. I think what we uncovered or unpacked there was the fact that there is this stages, depending in an organisation and approach, is that the birth of the contract's the end of my job. Actually, I just need to digitise the contract, then it's the end. I need to extract the obligations into a spreadsheet that then just sits on a digital shelf again somewhere else. Actually, it's beyond that to put in those things to work, to make sure that it maps back to the benefits realisation that you probably put together to justify spending the money in the first place, which should in theory be in the contract, but isn't always. Mm-hmm. So you can deliver a contract, but still not be recognising the business benefits that you thought of originally, right? So there's contracts, right?
And there's so much effort.
I'm not getting what I wanted.
There's so much effort spent up front in that business case, in that pre-contract award phase. And are you really realising the value from that?
That's it.
And you've got to loop it back. And it's really a closed loop to be able to articulate and justify the value that you set out or expected to ultimately get. And the other thing is that then starts becoming a feedback loop as well, right? In terms of, did we get the value? We got more, we got less. What were the assumptions that we made when we were doing the sourcing activity? So it all feeds back into not only managing post-contract better, but those insights feed back into the pre-contract world and makes them more impactful and more efficient.
And part of that, I suppose, that benefit analysis and the benefits you want and the value you want out of it, this is where we bring in the risk angle, is what risk are you willing to accept to recognise those benefits or recognise that value. And I know at the top we mentioned that some of the topic today was around risk mitigation, but I think we need to take it a bit earlier back than that. I'll stay with you, Tony, around, because I know it's a topic you love. You talk to a lot of people about, even today you've been talking to someone about it, which is risk for me is all well and good. A lot of people talk in risk, but there's that initial piece of, where does the risks come from? Mm-hmm. What's the curation? Do you want to talk a bit about that? Because I think we need to establish that point before you can mitigate anything.
Yeah, right? I think there's a paradigm or a frame of mind which thinks of risk as almost a tick box exercise, right? Where we know we need to carry out some risk management or risk assessment or due diligence, whatever kind of wording you want to use there. And as long as I carry out some light touch assessment of some kind, ask the right questions or ask some questions, then that's my job kind of done. We've done our risk management, we've done our piece. And really that's just the beginning of the journey. Ultimately,
point in time check, right?
Exactly. It's a snapshot that becomes stale, becomes out of date, misaligned to the buying organization, and ultimately in itself becomes risky. So that really leads you to the question of, well, what should I be doing? What's the output of doing that type of exercise? And ultimately, your output you should be thinking about is, well, I want to identify risks and manage that stock of risks appropriately. And that goes beyond just having some information about those risks, which is all good and well and provides a bit of knowledge and insight. But it's, what are the actions that are going to stem off those risks? What's the activity that is going to allow me to move that risk from what was a high risk, let's say, into something that's more palatable and low risk for the business?
So where do you think, I think this is what trips a lot of people up, which is why amount of consulting that I've done, you go and look at really some complex deals and some complex engagements, and the risk log is really light or really transactional. Where do you think the first load of risks come from? What do you think that, at what point should that risk stock be created, and what do you use to create it? Where does it come from?
Well, I think in general, most of the market view it as it's almost in that pre-contract award phase, that first scan assessment against those suppliers that are going to be partners. And so to really understand how that relationship is going to go and manage that appropriately, you have to output a risk stock from that. And then there's a business decision that goes, well, if we're going to bring these suppliers on, we have to either accept the risks or put in the right mitigations that are going to then, sometimes maybe within the contract, that then enacts and executes those actions during the life.
So what you're talking about is what I suppose more people would recognise it commonly as due diligence, right? Which is just
exactly
a very widely used term, I suppose, which is that initial risk creation, right? I think people look at due diligence in terms of do due diligence. If they fail spectacularly, we don't do business with them. But there is the grayer area that is, we're still going to do business with them, but there's these things that came out that were a little bit
completely, and those things that can just easily most often stay on the shelf, and never get looked at again until the worst thing happens and one of those risks is realised, and then it's a real problem, and that could have been avoided right from the get-go by actually managing the risk. And I think that's all good and well, and as an upfront exercise, but there's still that second order problem where risk appears at any point in that life cycle of the relationship. So the ability to capture that risk and put it into that existing risk stock is going to be ebbing and flowing all the time. And I think that's another aspect I see overlooked quite often.
So we see, and maybe over to you, Jesse, for this, we see regulations coming out now that they never tell you how to do stuff. They tell you kind of at a macro level what they suggest you cover, the guidance, right, which is you should do a robust risk assessment process at the beginning, and then very quickly after that, and periodically reassess, and you can define the period in what that means, which I think is what you're referring to, Tony, right? It's not ever static, it always changes. What do you, when you talk to customers on a daily, weekly basis, what's top of mind for them at the moment that's in a risk context, do you think, of where are people at? And is that right for your perspective, or what do you think they should be thinking of?
What I love doing what I do, because the people I get to talk to are really concerned with, and this really means something to them, is value realization. They want to fulfill their strategic purpose, which is accelerate the roadmap of this business. That's what procurement exists for at all, right? That is their strategic purpose. So I get to talk to a lot of people that know this. And to answer your question directly, what they say on this topic of risk is tired of the silos, tired of living with a TPRM team way over there with their big GRC construct and framework, thinking about risks to the business. And then here's me way over here, shuffling through contracts, making sense of obligations, interfacing with suppliers, and in the moment, encountering problems, challenges with delivery of this or that or this or the other obligation in this contract. It's a risk if it doesn't happen because we're counting on it, which is why we have a contract. And there's all kinds of activity in my life as a supply chain manager, vendor manager, contract manager, that because of our silos, I have to make myself familiar with this risk management policy posted and, sometimes all but forgotten, sometimes that's an overstatement, but on some SharePoint somewhere. And I have to think about all my relationships and all my contracts and the obligations in them and the things I'm measuring and the controls against some of them if it's understood as a risk. And I have to go inform that silo about it. And then they can have their more informed list of all these risks. And it's just a drag. It's extra work I have to go do. There's certainly no help I get from that silo coming my way, except maybe for that, as Tony said, that one-time survey on the way in. And even that's not so much about the contract. There's very little of it that is insurance levels in the contract they must maintain, things like that. But the real reason they're here to deliver something that's in the contract, our obligations and theirs, there where I can really help the business, the people that make up our market is in the moments of, for the ones that I manage directly and that are my remit directly, I need a way to capture and drive through a lightweight risk management process. And I need the supplier to help me in reporting on this for a while and make sure we're controlling and have the right key KCIs, key control indicators coming back in. And that's my problem number one. And problem number two, back to my silo problem, back to that vendor tail. Who's going to help me, aside from that one survey probably done on the way in, who's going to help me get across all these suppliers in their thousands, many thousands maybe, that I just don't have time. I could cock up some survey and send it to them, and then that'll start getting stale. And I have to make time to consume the results. And anyways, in this kind of risk management stuff that I should be getting help with. So what we here is break down my silos, okay? Somehow, please, I can't reorganize the company around this, but break down my silos so that I have a way to easily capture risk and feed them. They have ways to mitigate control risks that help me and that I have in my lap when I need to engage, and give me some digital advantages to get across the 95% of our vendor base that no one has time to talk to, and then do something like back to the do. I might get informed, help me get informed, but then help me do in automated fashion so that I know I'm helping mitigate the risk to the business that's latent throughout that supply chain, right? And I can't do it today because of the silos and the typical structure we always see with the risk experts way over there, the supply chain experts way over here, and silos, right?
That's a well-articulated reality of what I've seen of some large leading just standard risk platforms that are in big organisations. You go and look at them from what they've got around different areas of risk, and there's very light. It's not realistic as to what's in there because you've got what I call sort of knowledge dissemination, which you've got the knowledge and the SMEs at risk sit further back in the business, and the business operations line are the ones dealing and fighting the fires on a day-to-day basis. And unless that business operations line remembers whilst their hair's on fire that they have to go and get or to the other risk system, it just never manifests itself there. And to Tony's earlier point around due diligence, imagine you've done due diligence in like 2016 or 2017 on a really big deal, and now what, you're year 3 or 4 in, and all it says is about Brexit. Imagine how different the reality is in terms of the risk profile you've got and the risk stock you've got from that deal with the pandemic, the unrest that's happened, and everything else that's happened between now and then. You'd be reading it going, that's out of date. That doesn't apply, right? So I think that compounds the point that there's that need to continually curate those risks and mitigate on a day-to-day basis. And back to the point where we started this, I think, which is you've got to remain flexible in the way that you do business and conduct this with the help of digital tooling. That it's not always about the same subject. We're talking about sustainability today or the Ukraine stuff, etc. It'll be something else tomorrow. But you need the flexibility of how to deal with that something else when it comes.
I mean, you need it at your fingertips, don't you? I would want to be able to say, oh, I've just taken a policy directive to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion exists in my supplier base. Because if it doesn't, we're not going to win the business we need to win, and that's who we want to be anyway. So I need to assess. I need to gather facts. If the facts aren't on the right side of the line, I need a risk made right then. I'd like to flag that the next time we get into this contract, we see if we can negotiate a new obligation.
Yep.
I'd like to then track the performance to see what kind of diversity numbers they're posting up every month and if it's getting better. And look, right there, we just hit diversity and inclusion, contract management, risk management, and performance management in 2 sentences. Do I have to swim around in 7 systems and call 6 people to accomplish that? If I do, I'm probably just going to move on.
Yeah, and the system should talk to each other, right? The system should do that work for you. I think this problem...
Moment's lost if it's too hard. And that is really where the market...
About 20 years ago, it must have been 20, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I apply the same kind of logic to... I can't remember who it was now, what company I was working for, but someone kind of said to me, it was about... the time sort of personnel became HR and HR became people and that kind of... that evolution, and it was about the HR saying that everyone needs to be a good line manager, everyone needs to manage people, everyone needs to be a people person. So we'll give you the tooling, appraisal systems to do that, and we'll give you a framework to measure them against, but you must manage the people. It's not all personnel then or HR's job to manage the people. We help set out the framework. And I think risk management and cyber is exactly the same kind of thing. Is you will always have your SMEs that are further back, but you can't just by default engage the SMEs because that's a scale issue, right? And you're just going to block each other out. It's going to be so hard, so difficult to engage. To your point, you're just not going to bother, right? So you have to disseminate some of that into the front line for them to be able to do it themselves. So that's we've gone full circle, back to the framework point of what you're going to manage against and how you're going to do it and how you're going to capture it. And the easier you can make that for the person who's day-to-day in business ops, whose hair's on fire, looking at these topics, the more chance you've got of succeeding and the less chance you've got of a risk crystallising that, well, actually, an issue becoming a problem that actually is a risk that already crystallised that you never knew about, right, that you couldn't manage or mitigate. Gentlemen, that is our first episode of the Bridge podcast. Thank you if you're watching or listening to this. If you want to talk to me or Jesse or Tony, you can do that in the comments. And please like, subscribe, share, respond, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.
To keep up with the latest vendor ops news, subscribe here and follow us on LinkedIn. Links in the description below.